Centre for Historical Research with our current theme of health, disease and environment in world history, and it's our great pleasure today to host two of our own scholars, Larsen and Richard Steckel, and providing anything like an authoritative biography of these two would be almost impossible within the confines of an hour. So I'll be very brief here. Clark is Distinguished Professor of Social and Behavioural Sciences and Chair of the Department of Anthropology. He's former President of the American Society of Physical Anthropologists. He's an internationally renowned expert on bioarchaeology. He currently co-directs archaeological work in Turkey. He's written or edited 28 books, including my own favourite, Skeletons in Our Closet, Revealing Our Past Through Bioarchaeology. Rick is also a distinguished university professor, Professor of Economics, Anthropology and History. Rick's career, among many things, has focused on the history of that very complex question, the standard of living, and its transformation over time. A particular focus on anthropometric standards. Rick, among other things, is an auxologist. I get the opportunity to use the word auxologist very infrequently. Today was my opportunity to do that. He's a scholar of human growth, at least he's listed as such online. He's also written and edited a lot of books as well. Clark and Rick have devoted their careers in many ways to the long-term history of human bodily transformation. We're going to talk about more of this today. Commentary today will be provided by our own John Brooke, who, not to be outdone, is also a humanities distinguished professor, so we have a triumvirate of distinguished faculty here today. Clark and Rick are here to provide an interim report on health and ageing in the very long term. The emphasis here is on very. This is history, the grand sweep. And they're going to describe it far better than me. Rick is going to be doing doing the presentation, and John is going to do a commentary, and then there'll be questions after that. So, welcome, Rick and Clark. Thank you.
Well, I'll dwell for a moment on this very long-term question. What is the very long term? And it depends a lot on the discipline or science you come from. To a physicist, a second is an enormous period of time. To a geologist, 1,000,000 years is a short period of time. So what's long, what's short, depends on what you're studying and how much variation, how much significant change can occur in that period of time, and what ways do you have to measure that change. In background, I was trained in economics. Often we think of as a decade or 2 or 3 as a long period of time. Some of our models attempt to explain things over longer periods, and if you're in economic history, you might think, well, a half a century or a century or 2, this is a phenomena of industrialization occurred within that span of time. We're looking much longer and much wider than before. Most people haven't considered much longer periods of time, I think largely because they haven't had measures, comparable measures to assess what economists would call social performance, which includes many, many things. So we're trying to create a laboratory here that uses skeletal remains as the basic data source. We'll get into that, and Clark is far more expert than I in answering detailed questions on that. But we want to study health as best we can from skeletal remains over the last 10,000 years, roughly since the eve of the Neolithic Revolution. To the present. This is probably the best source we'll ever have to do this, and the field is changing rapidly, and we're learning more and more from skeletal remains, even compared to what was possible 5 or 10 years ago. So our main swath of interest, and this is the report. We have grants in the works to look at the swath of the quadrant of the Earth from northern Europe to southern Africa. And we'll be studying trauma, registers very easily on bones, inequality, and adaptation to the environment, especially oral health and osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, the childhood origins of adult health and disease for people in the medical field. This is sometimes called the Barker hypothesis. That is, to what extent do changes which occur in utero, and indeed for your mother and your grandmother while they were in utero, affect your health as an adult. So there's a long transmission, intergenerational mechanism potentially at work here, and we can have something to say on that with the types of evidence that we're looking at. And then there are various infectious and metabolic diseases. So the background to our work, if you're interested, is in the backbone of history. Health and Nutrition in the Western Hemisphere. It was published in 2002, and that was a project that we initiated in 1988. Took a little longer than we had hoped to get it off the ground and into print, but it does give a nice retrospective on pre- and post-Columbian America and health as can be learned from skeletal remains. And so we wanted to explain changes or differences in health and put the post-Columbian world in perspective. The most surprising result that came out of there, these are the dots, the locations of the sites where we got information. These are our collaborators, who all deserve a big mention because we're just creaming, all their hard work and putting it into a data source. And what did we collect? What did they give us? What did they devote to our project? Well, we can get from skeletons age of death. Skeleton constantly changes even during the course of this talk. Your skeleton will slough off some cells and add some new ones. You will be different when you leave this room for many, many reasons, not only because of what you've learned, because biologically you're different. And that systematic pattern of change gives us a lot of information on how old people were at death, which is a very important indicator in judging their health. Also, one can estimate sex. Not so reliably for children. The skeletons of boys and girls are about the same, but with puberty, things begin to change dramatically in the pelvis and in the cranium and other places too. We can measure height, shown here. Let's have a pointer. Right here from femur length. About a quarter of one's height registers in femur length. There's a very high correlation between one and the other. Height is very useful for assessing health in childhood. How tall you are depends on a blend of genetic inheritance from your biological parents and your environment. There's really an interplay, a complicated interplay between the two. So it's not just genes at all, although genes probably in well-nourished populations account for the vast bulk of differences in height. But when you compare not so well-nourished to very, very poorly nourished, the environment begins to play a more and more important role. In fact, if we all had ideal net nutrition in childhood, all differences in height would be biological. Okay, but seldom we attain such reaches. So this is a very good indicator of health in childhood. As are what are called dental hypoplasias, these enamel irregularities that appear between age about 6 months and 5 years of age. And they're non-specific in the sense that weaning diarrhea, major illnesses, malaria may cause these, and it leaves kind of a growth ring in your tooth. But we know they occur in early childhood. Then there are signs of, quote, anemia in quotes. The quotes, why? Because other things may cause what we see, these porosities in the skull and in the eye orbits, heavily due, we think, to iron deficiency, anemia. That could be dietary imbalance. It could be parasites like hookworm or some combination thereof. Then oral health, there are various carious lesions, abscesses, tooth loss and the like, which are a pretty good general indicator of health and diet. Osteoarthritis, one of my favorite elements in this list here because I've had 2 hips and 1 knee replaced. I played a lot of sports when I was young and I just wore down my joints, so they're heavily a sign of physical activity. I guess I slid into second base too many times. At least I got some doubles in this effort. So the joints change systematically as you wear away the cartilage. And the worst one I had was my left hip, where it was bone on bone. It was very heavily eroded, and boy, did that hurt. I'm fine now. Various infections, periosteal reactions. The periosteum is a tissue that nourishes the bone, covers the bone as a sheath. And that can get infected usually as a result of injury. So if you skin up your shins, if any of you have done hiking or that kind of thing, this happens. For most of us, we just scuff it off, slough it off, because we're in good health to begin with. But often these things will get invaded by strep or staph bacteria, and if you have a weakened immune system, they will progress. Chaucer wrote about these Canterbury Tales, these oozing sores that some of the pilgrims had as they made their way to Canterbury. There are many stories of the Spanish coming to the Western Hemisphere and noticing these boil-like substances on people's arms and legs that were oozing pus. Well, we've all had lunch. Just don't think about this before dinner, but they really hurt, and they're very much a sign of a compromised immune system. Then, of course, trauma. Here's a poorly aligned bone following a break, and in the era before there were casts and pins and screws and good surgery, almost surely there's misalignment and any kind of trauma. In fact, just to get a story, my daughter works at the Art Institute in Chicago, was walking across Michigan Avenue last week, and don't walk across, it's full of potholes, and she stepped in one and twisted her ankle rather badly, and a couple days later we made it to the hospital. They took an x-ray and said it's broken. So we made an appointment with an orthopedic person who looked at it and said, no, it's not broken. It's just there was a break several years ago on that site, but it happened to heal nicely. So you can even see with x-rays, you know, or earlier breaks, she just had a bad sprain. But they will show up. Often if there's misalignment, they will show up. And if you want to use x-ray, which is expensive and tedious, you can find more than you can with a visual eye. Then there are very specific diseases we didn't take down in the Western Hemisphere project because not enough people collected this data. Not that it wasn't interesting, we wanted data that most people collected, since 15 people were putting their evidence together. So one can detect leprosy, rickets, scurvy, TB, treponematosis and the like, or syphilis in bones as well. So that's what we're trying to collect now in the grant proposals that are underway. So this is the most interesting thing that appeared in the Western Hemisphere data, this decline in an index of all these 7 indicators of health: height, hypoplasias, signs of anemia, trauma, infection. Things were getting worse long before Columbus showed up. In fact, the healthiest people in this group are the hunter-gatherers. They're way over here on the left. And these are all urban, many of them urban folk. And it raises a big question, why do people ever move into cities if they're worse off in health? We talked about that earlier today. It's a very common pattern, now well established in the skeletal record. I think we have an explanation, or at least a colleague and I at University of Maryland do, and it's because the level of violence was very high at these sites here and very low at these over here. So how could that be? We think of cities as places of high violence today. Well, these were places of considerable order. And if you didn't behave, you could be expelled. And expulsion was equivalent to a death sentence in a world of this type. So they had very tight, I think, social rules, probably ritualized violence as well in some places in the Western Hemisphere, sort of like Sunday afternoon football, or maybe tomorrow evening football at the Ohio State University. So people, it's a trade-off. We said people will tolerate worse health, but we argue this, if they're safer. People will pay a lot for safety. They'll put up with a lot of infections and poor oral health to do so. I'm not saying that's the truth, it's a hypothesis at this point, but it's been a puzzle for many, many years why they coexisted. So why did health decline? People moved into less healthy ecological environments on every dimension we looked at. They moved to higher elevations, urban centers, open forest grassland. They began growing domesticates. We talked about this afternoon. It's producing high rates of dental caries, all this starch, so on and so forth. It's bad for your teeth. In an era before people had electric toothbrushes and fluoridation and the like. Then they moved away from the coast. These were all the healthy environments. They moved out of it. Why, we're not quite sure. But the ones on the right-hand side of that chart were nestled in unhealthy places, and those on the right were nestled in healthy places. The most unhealthy thing about their lifestyle was the trauma. But they had good indicators on these other scores. Now, let's fast forward a decade from this project. In the late 1990s, we started a similar program of research on Europe. And we did get some important money from the National Science Foundation for this work. And we have a larger sample. The Western Hemisphere is about 12,000 individuals. Here we have about 17,500 available for study. And this is their chronological distribution. In the sample we have more or less in the barn, and we're analyzing it now and hope to come out with a special issue of the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, as well as writing some books with collaborators here at the university looking at that data. So we have pretty good chronological resolution. There's a map of the distribution of the sites we've studied in Europe. There are people in the audience who have worked on this data and contributed to it. This is the outline of this special issue we hope to prepare. There's about 15 papers in it. I know the print may be a little small, but we have to speak a lot about context, because the skeletal remains themselves without context are essentially worthless. We have to know how people lived, their technology, what they ate, and so forth, what their political structure was, their housing and the like, in order to make sense or good use for our purposes of this information. And so we'll have a health index chapter, just like that slide showing declining health in Western Hemisphere. We'll have something similar for Europe. Climate, I have a couple slides on climate and health I'll show you. That's very important, I think, in the European case. And we now have much better chronological and geographic resolution of climate variables, temperature, and the like than we did in this Western Hemisphere project. What we did there with climate, frankly, is very primitive. It's embarrassing by today's standards. That's all we can. Then we'll have chapters on dental health and so on and so forth. Height, anemia and related conditions, osteoarthritis, and patterns of traumatic injury. So that's where we're headed. This is kind of, we're working on this year. We're writing these papers now. And we have kind of agreement and interest with the journal editors to devote a special issue to what we're doing. Now here's some climate slide available from a stalagmite, not a stalactite, a stalagmite. This is on the bottom from a cave in the high Alps, Western Austria, where one can get oxygen isotopes, which are the predictor of the climate. And the blue shows a 25-year moving average, so it's getting warmer here. This is the beginning of the medieval warm period. And then we have plunging temperatures beginning in the 12, 13, 1400, and even the variation. And this red shows the coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation of the temperature divided by the mean. And so while temperature declines, coefficient of variation goes up. And we do find that temperature matters. When it got colder, people got less healthy on most dimensions, with the exception of trauma. So there's a regression. If you want to look at these things, I'll explain what's in there. We have controls for rural and urban, urban less healthy. Mean temperature, though, is very important. As temperature goes up, people get healthier. They have a hefty positive coefficient here. Your leader better off. The monks are actually quite good off. Military better off because they're selective in hiring, conducting people. You need good health to get in there, and so on. So who's left out? The poor and the like, in the unspecified. And that gives you some sense of the kind of work one can do with context and knowing what the burial site represents. Is it paupers? Is it monks? Is it whatever? Is it elite? We have some elite sites, monarchy and so forth, nobility, and we can control for these effects. Now, let's fast forward another 5 to 10 years in this talk, and that's the current effort with grant applications to NIH and interest from the Wellcome Trust and maybe others in funding yet a much bigger enterprise. We stopped at 17,500. We want to go to 60,000 individuals. As I say, there's far, far more than that available for study, so we can cherry pick sites to get geographic, ecological diversity, which we have done. We've identified some 400 sites that we have access to, the skeletons that can be studied. We've written fabric software to code the data, use photography, on and on and on, to get a pretty good record of what we see there. And we'll go back to these great transitions from hunting and gathering to early agriculture. This is one of the great transitions in human history that affected our health and well-being. The rise of cities. We'll be able to make comparisons. See, what's nice about the biological standards like this, whether it's height or whether it's skeletal remains, they're relatively comparable across time and space. The measures that economists know and love well, gross domestic product, wages, and the like, you can't do that. In fact, what does gross domestic product mean in a hunter-gatherer society? I mean, they're not using markets. Okay, there are no prices. How do you even construct such a thing? Indeed, the further back you go in time, the weaker GDP becomes because less and less of productive activity flowed through markets. This is a measure of social performance for modern times, not for historical or really medieval or ancient times. It's just not very good. So we need something else. And frankly, injury 3,000 years ago meant something similar to what it would 200 years ago. You know, a fracture or a break. They're both very painful, and same would limit your mobility, would limit your productive capacity until mainly late 19th or 20th century medicine, where we can make repairs and take medication. So we can, across these grand transitions to global exploration and colonization, industrialization, and the vascular technological changes we've seen in the last couple hundred years, we can see how that impacted health. And this is one of the big questions in historical study. During these transitions, what happened to us in terms of our well-being, in terms of our quality of life, and what might have caused these changes? So here's a map of our sites for this new project initiative to NIH. We're looking at data from Northern Europe down to Southern Africa. So we think this is the most interesting place to spend resources to gather 60,000 data from 60,000 skeletal remains, because there's enormous biological, environmental, and ethnic diversity over that swath. It's huge. And we want to capture that variability. Variability is good, and evidence of it's a good thing to have in scientific study. We have a lot there. It's not so much in sub-Saharan Africa as we'd like. It's not a very hospitable environment. The soil and so on there, high pH tends to destroy bones. So if you have an aspiration to become a useful fossil long after you're dead, be careful where you're buried. You want sort of lower pH, stay away from high acidic soils, or you disappear. Okay, as these skeletons have from this part of Africa. So there are a lot of questions about potential selectivity in studying skeletons. How do they get into the museum where they're studied? How good is the excavation? We don't have time to go into that here, but I'll say that we're super aware of these issues. We've done our stratification here, coming up with our sites. So, what are we going to get in the way of context? A lot, because context is really super important. We will use radiocarbon dating, where it hasn't been done, to gather information on when people live. We use stable isotopes, as Professor Larsen spoke about earlier today, of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, strontium, to study diet and migration. And we'll have the individuals collecting the data prepare site reports from archaeological information and historical documents if they're available. But we'll need to know the minimum settlement size, what size of the community, whether they're hunter-gatherers of a dozen, 2 or 3 dozen individuals, or hundreds or thousands of people living at these sites. Their housing, how much trade they might have been involved in, their likely political structure, the extent to which they created monumental architecture. I think as a rule of thumb, monuments before modern machines were bad for your health because generally diets weren't all that good, and they're a sign of heavy inequality. All these people moving, pounding rocks, okay, without modern earth-moving equipment is hard on your joints. It's hard on your net nutrition and the like. And so they're signs of inequality, enormous inequality. But we can get geographic information systems data about the terrain and sources of water, proximity to navigable. We can get good climate data now in a way we couldn't even 10 years ago. And we'll have a central service that will provide data collection, cleaning, and distribution to people who want to use the evidence for whatever papers they're running. So we've identified our 400 skeletal collections. We issue site numbers, hire and train graduate students to collect data. So you see there's enormous logistics in this. And after working on this for some 20 years, I understand why it hasn't been done before. It's because the logistics are like daunting. You've got to have a lot of good, careful organization. So many things can go wrong. That you have to have a good project administrator keep the thing together. We've already developed our software. We use photography to code lesions that may have ambiguous meaning, so one can have committees arbitrate. That's our administrative structure. In this, so we're getting a good look inside. These are our sub-projects dealing with violence and with GIS, trauma, disease, degenerative conditions, and the like. We have advisory panels, internal and external, who will assist us. And these are our 5, I have 5 slides left, dealing with developmental origins, how our childhood indicators, the hypoplasias, the signs of anemia, and femur length or growth are correlated with adult height or adult health conditions. Anything from osteoporosis to degenerative joint disease to length of life. That's why knowing how long people live is crucial to this exercise. In earlier work, we found high connections between those 3 childhood indicators and how long people live. So stressful early childhood means, implies, or at least is highly correlated with bad adult health outcomes. And certainly medical people debate why that relationship exists. Barker has his theories, other people have their other theories, and the like, but I don't think there's much debate. Why are we entering this debate at all? It's because the people we study lived under extreme conditions. The question we can answer, I think of interest to medical people, is, does life under extreme stress, a pressure cooker, expedite the process? Do these degenerative conditions show up earlier if you had very harsh childhoods, and by modern standards, these people had very harsh childhoods, it's hard for us to imagine how difficult and stressful life was for people who lived hundreds, much less thousands of years ago. There's nothing in our experience even close to it. It's so hard to imagine. But we have evidence on that. So that's the hypothesis to test. In other words, do diseases which show up today in people's 50s and 60s, did they show up in people's 30s and 40s that led to early death? Okay? If the conditions were more extreme. Okay, inequality, of course, is a favorite subject of social scientists, historians for years. And what's the relationship between inequality and health? We have some measures of inequality. I mentioned monumental architecture, which is a signature. Must have been inequality to produce it when human energy was the main thing that moved and carved rocks and built monuments. But there are others. There are era goods, show status of individuals. We have some graves for paupers. We knew they were poor. We don't have graves for elite. The question is, what's the biological distance between these people, as measured in skeletal remains, relative to whatever we can get to measure social distance? Was it greater or lesser than in modern times? Indeed, the big question is, when did social distinctions emerge? And then how did that impact health? Did hunter-gatherers have such distinctions or not? Were they all equally well or bad off? And when did they become profound? At some point in our lives, they did become profound because they exist today. We just don't know when and why it happened. Then we have various measures of infectious and metabolic disease. We're interested in antecedents of these: scurvy, rickets, syphilis, TB, leprosy, and the like. There are various hypotheses as to when leprosy appeared and disappeared, when syphilis emerged, and so on. The role of vitamin D deficiency in latitude. Actually, rickets is coming back as a concern today. I happened to have a general physical a few months ago, and my physician had just spent 10 days in Florida in the sunshine. He was curious. He came back and measured his vitamin D. It was quite low. He was very concerned and started taking vitamin D supplements. So he tested me, and I spent some time in the sun, and it was a little low too. And I take supplements already. So all these kids getting lathered with sunscreen and the like may have an effect. It may be subclinical, but that doesn't mean it isn't significant. I mean, what's clinical? If your legs blow, or your pelvis sags a little bit, or something like that. But that doesn't mean it doesn't affect your immune system or other aspects of your health. There may be lots of connections there. And so the people who moved out of Africa and into Europe probably had a tough time here, because those who left had dark pigmentation. And over a period of 50, 100 generations, through selectivity, they developed light pigmentation, because those are the only folks who survived. But those first ones to show up almost surely had heavy doses of rickets. We can test that hypothesis and see. So moving out of one's, more generally, I think, native environment, the environment to which you and your ancestors have adapted, is probably physiologically stressful. Because you're moving to different immune system, different pathogen system, different conditions of sunlight and the like. So, why did people move? Were they pushed out? Whatever. We can assess biological causes. Chronic skeletal and dental degenerative conditions. This is Professor Larsen's area of expertise, a project on oral health and degenerative joint disease and its antecedents or precursors. We can test a number of hypotheses about diet, inequalities, social complexity, and the like, and its relationship to that. We have trauma. This is our last big project. We can measure I think we can distinguish deliberate from accidental trauma. A lot of accidental trauma is broken wrists or broken ankles. Deliberate traumas to the face and to the head, for the most part. You could fall out of a tree on your face, I guess, but mostly you're being hit by a blunt instrument or weapon wounds, certainly. Those are easily identified on individuals. So, in an earlier work in the Western Hemisphere data, the accidental determinants of accidental trauma are very different from that of deliberate trauma. Accidental trauma is related to environment and terrain. Uneven terrain, rocks, hills, and the like, people fall, break wrists, break ankles. It shows up high there. And it's low near the coast. Okay? But the deliberate trauma is very different in terms of what seems to cause that. And in the Western Hemisphere project, we didn't have very good measures of inequality. We did deliberate settlement. As I've already said, it was highest in hunter-gatherers. And other people have noticed that too. It's not just the Western Hemisphere project. So we think, this is my colleague at Maryland, that the invention of property rights had something to do with it, because hunter-gatherers were constantly fighting over what was theirs and what was somebody else's. And it's at the margins of hunting, fishing, and the like, of defining what was yours, what side of the river were you supposed to be on or not, or which side of the valley or the hillside or the mountain, that led to these enormous disputes. And of course they would have arisen as some groups expanded in size through higher birth rates, lower death rates, others shrinking. There was this constant dynamic, this churning for control of resources. And at those boundaries, there was conflict. And if you went out in a small group, you were subject to being attacked by others. That's what we think the mechanism was. In these early cities, unhealthy in other dimensions, controlled violence in a way, we think, that led people to tolerate this kind of thing. So we will be interested on the role of inequality, density of settlement, technology in use, geographic setting and the like, and its effect on this. One thing that led to our study of this, the UN is now very interested in trauma and violence. The costs in the United States alone of trauma is billions of dollars per year in terms of healthcare costs. It's a huge public health problem, and one of the UN reports casually mentioned, as far as we can tell, people have always been violent. Well, maybe that, no evidence. No evidence, absolutely none, for which to support such a statement. It isn't coming from physical anthropologists. I don't know who it's coming from, but it's not found in the records. We want to try to answer that question using some real data, some real information, and to find out in our past, of the last 10,000 years, were there pockets when there was very little trauma? Were there episodes, were there locations when there were social, economic, environmental conditions in which it was very low, and others in which it was very high? And that's a starting point for any kind of analysis, just looking at these outliers and see the conditions under which they lived. I think that'll be a very important project. There is a colleague here in the history department whose recent book came out, John Brooklyn, mentioned that deals with homicide and goes back 200 or 300 years. We want to go back 5,000 or 10,000, and we have some very good measures to see conditions under which it may have been higher or lower. So that pretty much is a wrap. Where we've been and where we're going, maybe I should turn it over to John, or do you want questions at this point?
I want to make a few comments. I think it was very short, and then we'll give you guys a moment to kind of hot state. The project that Rick and Clark have been involved in for 20 years, I began to be kind of peripherally involved in about 10, 12 years ago. I mean, I've gone to intervene. I'm going to intervene. That's how I see this. This is kind of, in some measure, my third intervention, my third chance to talk to you guys in a public forum about your project. One was the original origin of the European project back around 2000. One was the origin of the wider global project about 3 years ago. Many of you might be in shock if you're not anthropologists or archaeologists because of the time frame, 10,000 years. I studied anthropology and archaeology and history, and it doesn't bother me. It was part of my training at Cornell and I ran up and down stairs between the historians upstairs and the anthropologists and archaeologists. Bob Asher was in the cellar in the basement, perfect for an archaeologist. And they told me years later that I was negotiating between these two warring camps. One of the things I learned back then, and have been reviving in a global project of my own, is to get back into the archaeological data. To get beyond, I think I know how to use historical data, I know how to use documents, but we also have to think about using everything we have available. Years ago, 30 years ago, Bernard Bailyn talked about latent history and manifest history being the stuff we talk about, and latent history being the stuff that happened that we don't even know about. Well, what you're doing is latent history. It's quiet, it's not recorded except in the stuff in the ground. And the stuff in the ground lies in layers, and it has to be interpreted, and in fact those interpretations are really not that different from what we do when we interpret documentary evidence. But here in this case we're talking about the bones speaking from the past. We're talking about the archaeological record producing texts. The body is a text, the remnants of the body is a text. It is, and sometimes you spend time looking at these pictures and not actually the skeleton. I don't know what you do when you actually sit and talk to York himself, but these are people. These were people who lived at a point in the past, and we don't know their names. And they actually still speak to us. And here we're talking about thousands of them and summing them up in aggregates, but each one lived a particular life. Now, this project that they've been involved with for 20 years is reaching a point now of, I mean, actually, in conversations today at an earlier session, and today there's a slight hint of the people who have been giving us trouble over the years that I've been hearing from Clark and Rick. Well, this is actually a very propitious moment for them, I would hope. Randy Roth's book that just was mentioned, American Homicide, has put on the table a quantitative analysis of who murdered whom and why, which is a very interesting analysis. Then most recently, I think that was 2009, but 2011 has produced two books. One by Robert Fogel and an assembled team. Robert Fogel was Rick Steckel's advisor at Chicago several years ago. I think it's called The Changing Body, is that right? This is a summary of all the work done since 1700, I mean on record since 1700, on the changing body, how we have gained in height and weight and endurance and what they call techno-physical evolutionary capacity. Just the sheer ability to work. One of the things they found a couple of years ago was that 25% of the French population, they estimate, as of just before the French Revolution, a half century before, was physically unable to work because they simply weren't strong enough. So this book, The Changing Body, which is hot off the press, summarizes the historical data since 1700, and in effect, Clark and Rick's projects are carrying us back to the Neolithic, where actually Steven Pinker picks up on a theme that you just were stressing at the end of your opening comments here. Violence. The book is called The Better Angels of Our Nature, I think. It's just out, and he is stressing the significant decline in violence over time and hitting on exactly the points that Rick was just stressing. Law and order, the city, the rise of the state as enforcing property, protecting property for better or worse, and reducing the scale of violence. And then all these softer things like the rise of sensibility, the rise of empathy, the rights revolution, and its reduction of the level of violence. This is an enormous book. It's 700 pages, monster book on the decline of violence in human history. I think I've just skimmed it, I haven't read it, but I think they actually cite some of the early manifestations of the violence data coming out of the skeletal studies as some of his evidence, but there's going to be a lot more systematic work being done by this project and these projects. Now, this is where I'd like to just quickly make a few comments about about frameworks. I always like to kind of push these guys a little bit over the years. And Rick is stressing transitions. I'm writing a global book, and I want to do both transitions, but also crises. I see there are these critical transitions. One is speciation, we're not going back that far, but the other one would be, the out of Africa moment, the global expansion, which actually you guys aren't going to have the data for, really. But this question of, say, vitamin D as the early African population spread into Eurasia and are stressed by vitamin D questions. So we have this African to global population transition at some time, actually, traditionally we saw it about 45,000 years, now they're saying 60, and actually now we're actually saying possibly 200,000 years ago, the first people making the move across into Saudi Arabia out of Africa. The agricultural transition is actually in your date range. You're probably not going to hit it in this project in its current form, but probably in the future you will.
Well, it occurred at different times in different places.
But what I like to stress, just for the audience here, is that we need to differentiate that transition into two phases. It's not just when did crops get domesticated, but when did populations become fundamentally and decisively dependent upon them and elaborate their use of those crops? That's the point where serious transitions unfold. Fertility explodes, and people go through what's called the secondary products revolution, where you don't just kill and eat the animals, kill and eat the plants, but you turn them into things, particularly the animals. You use the sheep and the cattle for milking, for wool, and you do there's a whole array of things that are being done there. And this correlates pretty nicely with the rise of frameworks that probably mean the beginnings of law, beginnings of property in the late Neolithic and the early Chalcolithic. But clearly, the state transitions are very important. What happens to health in terms of violence? When you go into that state transition, what happens to disease regimes when you go into a state transition? What does it mean to be living in a geographically bounded polity? Are you protected from distress? Is food distribution better? But are you also in the context of a kind of a boiling disease regime as populations grow and disease regimes build up? So we have these transition questions. But we also have crisis questions, and so I would hope that you guys would think about crisis. I've decided that we really have to see the Holocene in terms of a series of roughly every 2,000 years, big multi-dimensional crises, one of which, the most recent one, was the Little Ice Age period, which increasingly is slopping over and perhaps dynamically related to an explosive fundamental disease impact of the Black Death. The newest analysis of the Black Death is that it's probably caused by, driven by the first ripples of the Little Ice Age. And we're talking, a quarter, probably 40 to 50% of populations being killed within a very short amount of time. And so if there are these phases of crisis, one being the Little Ice Age, the last one before that is the Bronze Age, Iron Age transition. I actually see in what scraps of height data that I can find is that heights after 1200 BC drop, and then they recover during the climate optimum. And then they clearly go grinding into an early modern low during the Little Ice Age, in all of its multiples. So there may actually be broad ebbs and flows in that. Then there's the problem, on the other hand, what about these really runty Romans? The Romans were short, and the Romans clearly were not well-fed, but they weren't famines. Peter Garnsey's established this, but he's also established that something was wrong with child rearing. And actually, the most recent articles in the AJPA, which is Clark's journal, pretty much nails this down. That the Roman skeletons suggest very strikingly that there was clear child neglect, possibly culturally framed. And when you were a barbarian, you did a lot better. Simultaneously at the same time, within the same climate system, same soils, barbarian children did better than Roman children, because Roman children were swaddled, put in a dark room, and more or less neglected. And if they survived, okay, they were stunted, and it had long-term consequences. That seems to be so what are the impacts on your data of things that are probably dysfunctional cultural regimes that are going to be hard to sort out. And then I want to close with just a thought about energy. Increasingly, I'm thinking about energy as if we think of this whole biophysical process of human transformations and development through crises over the last 10,000 years. Everybody has to work. Work involves calories of input and really calories of output to product. And the record of that actually we saw today in an earlier presentation of what the stresses were on bones. This actually can be directly measured by in these analyses, and very clearly one of the things they've shown, for example, is how much they've now done experiments to show how much energy it takes to cut down a tree with a stone tool versus cut down a tree with a bronze tool, to cut down a tree with an iron or a steel tool. And we're talking fundamental leaps in energy efficiency. The wheel as energy efficiency. All sorts of pre-fossil fuel energy efficiencies which may contribute to a gradual decline in the stresses on the human skeleton over time, or differences between different cultures that do or do not have these possibilities. The grinding wheel. I have some data from Lawrence Angel in Conan Armalagos, which shows that women in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Roman period, from the Hellenistic period, suddenly were 2 centimeters bigger. The men stayed the same, and the women made this big growth spurt. Why did this happen? Well, one thing that happens in this period is the watermill spreads throughout Eastern Mediterranean, and rather than women working the hand quern 3 hours a day, that work was exported over to water. Maybe young women actually had some time to grow. So I'm suggesting that the energy inputs play a major role in here. Another little thing that I find quite dramatic, I take Rick Steckel's classic curve of U.S. male heights, which, if I had a piece of chalk, I would show you. Americans were very tall until about 1840. The cohort born in 1840, Rick demonstrated, when, 1985? Roughly 81. 81. And then suddenly the Civil War generation plummeted between 1840 and the 1880s. Much shorter. The impact of urbanization, the impact of the disease, the distance from food, the quality of food. And then after starting in 1890, the male heights and female heights as well start moving up and then start curve upward toward modern heights. The other thing that starts and moves exactly with that curve is fossil fuel use, following the exact line. Now, there's going to be a lot of explanation that has to go between heights and fossil fuel use, but clearly there's a question here to ask about a system. How does energy use, energy efficiency affect human health through some kind of biophysical interaction? So I think I'll leave it at that, and that's my comment. You guys want to take some questions?
So just a couple of comments on what John said. Thank you very much. We do like crises. And certainly we haven't emphasized them as much as we should. And the thing is, they happen from climate, and we have a much improving climate record now, but there's also war, pestilence, you know, both of these. Some can be dated with some precision that change human quality of life and human interaction. So we will be looking for those, and so we should have given that more, I think, more emphasis here. One of the problems with using skeletons to some extent as opposed to historical heights, we can't really arrange these data by birth cohorts. We'd love to do that, to know exactly the year people were studying were born. That would really enrich. Carbon dating was plus or minus 30, 40 years, and if you look at stratification, I don't know, plus or minus 50, you know, it's more than.
You know. The cemeteries are typically, you've got a pretty wide range of dates, you know, within 200, 300, 400 years. So to pinpoint that crisis is usually pretty difficult. I know how much you love crises, but
well, let me just quickly interject there, which is that I finally got a hold of one of the plague pit cemeteries. So in other words, when people die, when there's a real crisis, they die in large numbers, and they are stuffed in a big pile in the ground. And there's this place called the East Smithfield Cemetery, just northeast of the Tower of London, and it is absolutely a plague pit from 1349 to 50. So you know exactly who, you know when they died. Absolutely, you have this beautiful sample of the neighborhood at that point. You don't have the date of birth, but you can guesstimate that.
Yeah, in that case,
but
you've got
these people are short. They are this is urban London, and they are very, very short.
And you've got a clear crisis, very tight dating. So it's those cemeteries that
it's a military battleground.
Right.
It's very hard.
Massacres and so forth. But really,
Yeah, that's the problem. But therein lies a big problem, which is where are all the plague pits? They're very hard to find. They haven't found any from the just Indian plague, which is
they're just a few.
yeah.
But maybe we should open up for
any
comments. I'm sure you've been boiling and keeping these to yourselves and biting your tongues and all that stuff, repressing your urges to ask a question. Now it's just yours.
They're still repressed.
Took so much energy to do it, yes.
I was just wondering, I know already the scope of this project has increased almost exponentially, but if there was any plans to include data from Asia eventually?
Oh yes, we've made attempts to do that, to granting agencies, and I think we came this far from being funded at NSF many years ago when they had a huge interdisciplinary initiative, and we came in second. We did get some money, but for a much smaller project, and we tried to interest the Wellcome Trust in this, and I think we came in with too big a budget. So this quadrant approach is about the best we think is feasible to get funded, and it will be a great leap forward. But we made contacts in Asia. We had a meeting here 3 or 4 years ago. We had people from China, Australia, and so on and so forth, all around the world trying to, a lot of the work is finding collaborators and getting agreements and access to materials, which is a little tricky, can be tricky in China and other places. So that's in our mind, but we've set it aside as not being all that practical at the moment. Maybe when some of these results get published and people see what you can do with this, we'll have better luck.
Yeah, part of the issue too is there are different cultures of bioarchaeology, and the sort of traditional one is this is my site, my data set, and over my dead body, so to speak, will I have, well, everybody in a big project have access to my data. Because this is a huge shared project where all the data is available to everybody in the project, publicly available. And the sort of pre-2000 generation of bioarchaeologists, physical anthropologists, are not particularly interested in that kind of approach. So there are other stumbling blocks, but we're showing the way and how to look at video.
There's some headwinds out there.
So when you propose a study like this, how much of the cost is associated with actually accessing the remains, or are the remains basically there and you are given permission to do your analysis.
Yes,
right?
there's
So-
no money in these projects for excavation.
so this-
It's already been done. The museums have stored, curated, in varying degrees of completeness, the remains that we know provenance and so on. Otherwise, we wouldn't study it. You have to know a lot about the site to make good use of it. Over half our budget, beyond that, probably 60% goes for data collection. This is paying graduate students and postdocs to actually sit down, unpack the skeleton, look at it. Takes about an hour, 20 minutes if we have photography to code it. We have some considerable experience doing this, and we can estimate dollar costs and so on, or at least number of hours or minutes it's going to take to do this. That's where most of the money goes. And then, there's travel and training sessions and administration and the like. But it's expensive, even beyond that point. And excavation would just make it horrendously expensive, and plus would add a lot more time. Plus there's so much material there. We don't need to excavate. It's already been done.
So what has formed the justification for the excavation? Other
Oh.
types of research or?
Well, a lot of these, Clark spoke of Chatahoyuk this morning. That's a deliberate excavation. This is a very old site. It was purposely excavated. A lot of the other ones come from construction projects where they find burial grounds they didn't know was there. There's one, for example, that we'll get into our data set in the new project between King's Cross and St. Pancras train stations in London. There was 1700s burial ground there. It was forgotten about. They just happened to locate those train stations, or if they did find graves there, they forgot about them, threw away the remains. But now that they're building the link to the tunnel at that location, they ran into about 350 burials. So it's this. So a lot of them occur around urban areas because that's where most of the excavation is. There's bias in that sense, but we can correct for it if we know it's there. We just sample more intensively from rural areas. So,
In Professor Brooks' class right before this, we talked about the intersection between the agricultural revolution and the wear and tear that you see on people participating in that. But what I was wondering is, did you see anything involving like the domestication of animals, any markers that you can see like from just being able to have like protein from like milk or just the animals themselves? Did you see any impacts on that?
Like, yeah, I was just gonna, the record investigation is not going to be picked up in human scale, so your question's a good one, but at present, we really don't have those kinds of tools to pick up on the change in diet of eating non-domesticated animals, say non-domesticated cattle, and then cattle domesticated, and what that signature will occur in the domesticated cattle. Now, if the non-domesticated and domesticated cattle have very different distinctive diets, then we'll be able to pick up isotope signature in the human skull. That'd be a great project. It's not currently in the purview of what we're doing now, but would be sort of a good one for the sort of future checklist. Yeah, that could be your future career.
sign them up. We have one best.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could elaborate on who you see as the intended audiences for this project and this data. I mean, is it primarily for archaeologists and anthropologists, or do you envision a broader audience?
Eventually it'll become public. This is a condition of funding now. In fact, the data for the Western Hemisphere project, I showed you the slide of the book cover, I think is available on our website here. You can download it. And that for the European project will soon be available. And any future data we collect will be available too. So I've been surprised at who's used the Western Hemisphere data. Political scientists, all kinds of folks out there we get questions from. But we're looking for this intersection of people, of social scientists, archaeology, medicine. And we don't think there's been enough crosstalk among these groups, or the phrase I used before, failure to communicate, across these these teams of researchers. I think they have a lot to learn from each other, a lot to offer. They don't understand each other's methodologies very well, and they're often going different purposes and different very specific goals, but they would pause and ponder what's really out there. I think we could make life a lot more interesting. I think at this point it's sort of an interdisciplinary, curious audience that will benefit immediately most from what we've done. And some scientific literacy is required, I think, to understand what we're doing. Some background in science is helpful. But I think training in history is enormously helpful too, because so many of the interesting questions come out of that field of study. There's been so much work done already. All we're doing really is adding a new measure of social performance. So the questions are there, they just haven't been integrated and digested with these new approaches to measure.
Have you considered, or would you consider supplementing your data with mummified remains? And how would you?
Yeah, well, there is a body, so to speak, of data there. And here's the thing about mummies. They're very interesting. They look interesting. They're kind of fascinating and so forth. But it's very difficult to get at the kinds of data that we're collecting. I mean, we've got all this stuff covering the skull, and it's usually rock hard, and usually frustrating and time-consuming and expensive.
You can't take them apart. You know.
Right. So in other words,
50 or 100 years ago, people did that all the time. As a matter of curiosity, they were in there with saws cutting things out, but not anymore. So
too expensive. In other words.
But mummies occasionally do provide little scraps of biological information. You know, did Ramses have smallpox or whatever? Or can we see that? Can we find? I mean, the Iceman from the Iceman is a late Neolithic individual who was froze to death, possibly killed on the glaciers, and was buried in a glacier 5,000 years ago, and popped out about 10 years ago, and all sorts of information coming out of this guy, what he was eating, what he was sick from, you know, little biological pieces of information about one Neolithic person 5,000 years ago. But again, that's one person versus thousands and thousands.
Right. It's interesting. It's fascinating, but we're really trying to get at population perspectives and patterns of the human condition. So, with the single, really fascinating mummy. I mean, I'm glued to the television when it's on, but you know, for our particular project, not particularly useful.
yeah, if we could get 50 Icemen at different ages, that would be that's really creation. It might take another century to get them. But yeah, I've seen that one. It's in. I think there's a museum in Bonn, if I'm not mistaken. If you're over there, I would highly recommend a visit. Because they've reconstructed what he looks like, all his clothing, everything. It's just fascinating. And they have X-ray, I think, of the arrow point in his left shoulder. Very popular.
I'm not quite sure how to frame this, but when you've got such a vast amount of data, there's an inevitable urge or tendency towards producing sort of grand conclusions, grand narratives. This was triggered by John mentioning thinkers, which effectively says that we're less violent than we've ever been before. It's a sort of triumphalist narrative of human progress. Your graph that you had earlier on could be interpreted as the exact opposite. It's kind of the fall that we used to be really healthy, apart from occasional smacks in the skull, when we lived in a together society with urbanisation, industrial, everything down the line. And it seems like every major transition does have some kind of collective traumatic effect upon skeletons. I mean, the Industrial Revolution does produce this curve that's the same in the UK. There does seem to be this dip with the move to settlement. And so I wonder if you've got these two incredibly simplistic narratives of rise and fall, how are you going to negotiate that? How are you going to anticipate a conclusion that avoids both of those?
No, that's a very interesting question. We don't want to over-synthesize and look at the forest and ignore the trees. And I I think one answer to that is if we had larger budgets and a lot more data. This is indeed one of the comments on one of the grant proposal reviews, is how we're going to look at the smaller important changes in history with this grand overview. And one answer to that is this grand overview has never been painted before. We don't have a big sketch of human change, social, economic, biological change over the last 10,000 years. There's been speculation about what it looks like. For this project, I think its biggest contribution will be that. Just what happened. What were we like at the eve of the Neolithic Revolution? What were we like in more modern times, and what happened in between? We originally asked for information to get 300,000 individuals. I think that would have been enough to tell a much more detailed story. But it's just within the realm of financial feasibility, it's not there. But I'll say the potential is there. The materials are there. You can easily do it with enough money. And we hope what we do will pique interest from a number, from medicine, public health, to history, to economics, to geography, to whatever, to get many projects like this underway, and certainly bigger ones. It can be done. I think we've shown that at a minimum. You can do this. And so, we'll get there. I'm patient. It's just
the downside with so many individuals, though, is that sorting out the details. I mean, so we'll figure out the forest, but there are all these sort of sub-stories and complexities.
Fascinating books in and of themselves, you know. Yes. Oh, go ahead. She had her hand up.
I'm speaking about sort of the interdisciplinary applications of your project. I was wondering what you thought the potential applications for the medical field would be.
Yeah, we were talking about that before the talk.
Well, I'll start that.
Okay.
Yeah, the application in the medical field. Here's the thing, this is what I tell physicians and people in biomedicine and so forth, is that the current conditions of health, well-being, didn't happen by magic, right? There's a whole context for it. So the power of our project is to show, in part, that context. What happened before sets the stage for today. And the talk I gave this afternoon, I think it's important to sort of point out that sedentism, disease, health, dietary changes are still ongoing and have their roots 10,000 years ago and before. So I think that's the most important message, but there are others. What do you think, Rick?
Well, yes. I mean, we have identified some specific hypotheses. You know, life as in a pressure cooker as a child. What does that do to you? Those kinds of stories have, I think, immediate resonance with people like David Barker. But I really think, in a way, this project is like building a Hubble telescope. The real Hubble peers deep into the universe and deep, deep into the past, and lets us see things and know about things we didn't know existed before. And I believe the people who built that didn't know what they would find. But they found all kinds of interesting things. But we can't go to NIH and NSF and say, we think there are interesting things in our past, to give us the money. And we'll find interesting things for you. It's just, maybe astronomers can get away with that, but we can't, and you certainly can't in medicine. And this is where we think most of the money is. You've got to have some hypotheses, and we think a lot about your question. It's a very important question. Why would NIH or Wellcome do something like this beyond intellectual curiosity? What's the payoff? What's the payback? We have to have something. And I think there's some on trauma. This Pinker's book is certainly getting huge attention, and Randy Roth's book too. How violent? What's it like in our past? We can answer that question. That's well within our means. Some of these others are a little more, the role of inequality and so on. Our measures of inequality aren't as good as they are today, and that's been pointed out to us, and therefore are they useful at all, and so on and so forth. So I'll say at this point it's a challenge, but what we're doing a lot of is basic research, trying to paint this big picture against which lots of smaller pictures. Did you have a question?
I guess I was going to comment on the earlier question about elucidating some of these changes in health at the more local level, and I was going to say that one of the major contributions of the project is either by funding or facilitating this research at individual sites, then those archaeologists, whether they're grad students or postdocs, are usually then using their analysis of that specific site to tell the story of what's going on at that site. And so you are getting the information about the local level in addition to what you're doing.
Yeah, we think the big advantage there is to put these local sites in context. I mean, how do you know whether what exists at a local site is different, unusual, interesting, and what really needs to be explained about it? Or is this, you know, run-of-the-mill garden variety site, not much different from the others? Without the big picture, you wouldn't know.
Exactly.
You know. Good point.
What major technological developments have happened since you did the Western project, and how is that changing the character of your current project?
Yeah, certainly. Well, let me say some of the things we clearly, as measures of climate, are much better now than they were. That project was started 20 years ago. I mean, it was out of date 15 years ago. We knew it, but it was too late to change it. And so we've improved on comparability of measures. This has been a criticism of Conan Melgus, paleopathology at the origins of agriculture. It's to some extent a criticism of the Western Hemisphere vote, because different people collect it in different times and places without the idea of putting it all together into a hopper. We just work with people who've had similar methods. Now, as Professor Larsen pointed out, there's different traditions in bioarchaeology around the world, and on a project like this, we can't assume a North American tradition in terms of collecting evidence and familiarity. So we have to train people. We have a very detailed code book that has illustrated with photographs and drawings as to how to score this or that. Some of our measures, like femur length, are quantitative, and it's hard to make an error of any importance. But others on degenerative joint disease or oral health, whatever, the margin's a little fuzzy. We've designed inter-observer error quizzes based on photographs, and people who we've trained generally score similarly on that. We've added now photographs, which didn't exist in any of the earlier ones, so we can keep a digital library, digital record of everything we see. And so if later people, generations come along and want to redo our work, they certainly are welcome and will be able to do so. And photography has certainly advanced enormously. When I was looking, even 10 years ago, 12 years ago, at getting a 5 megapixel camera, I mean, it was like $5,000, $10,000, and was kind of out of budget. And now, a few $100 you can get ring flash and these other things, which is used in surgery and dentistry to take very high resolution shadow-free images, and we'll include that. So that's helped a lot. But I think Clark knows a lot about isotopes and other things that weren't in the Western Hemisphere project at all.
Yeah, the dietary reconstruction is so much more accurate now than it's ever been because of isotope-borne chemistry. Lots of really interesting developments have happened just in the last decade.
Carbon dating has improved in accuracy, precision. Cost has fallen. We'll leverage all of that. And then, of course, the internet makes it possible to pool all these data in a way that 15 years ago, we didn't do the Western Hemisphere project this way. Those data were coded on primitive spreadsheets. I mean primitive by today's standards. And we didn't want to have any more than 132 columns in our database because we couldn't print it out on a printer without overlaps and lines. And so we carved and sliced to get this thing down to that. And so we coded 41 variables. But the new software has 350 or something. I mean, it just time, date, stamps, you name it. It's incredibly detailed. There's room for comments and notes and all these things. Photographs of the site. It's so much more richly documented than before. And so we think we're taking advantage of that. And frankly, if we were to do this 10 years from now, I'm sure methods of ancient DNA analysis, which are now very exciting and are improving, on and on and on, we would get more out of it. But the great advantage of what we're doing even now, so painting this big picture, is you can always go back to the remains because the museum, the box or bag number, the collection, it's all part of the record. You can go back. You can look at that femur again. You can get a tooth sample if you want. So it's organic. It's an organic research enterprise in that sense.
You just mentioned ancient DNA analysis. Have you started that work, or is that in the plans?
Well, we did ponder putting money into that, and there is a group working, I think, out of the University of Durham with these ambitions, and the Wellcome Trust is very, very interested in this. We've been speaking with them for years. This is not really our area of great expertise. In order for them to put a lot of money in it, they wanted to do double-blind studies. That is to have samples of the same bone material done by different labs to see if they get exactly the same results. And I think they're satisfied to some extent on that. And so what they're looking at is pathogen DNA, tuberculosis, plague, and things of this sort. We think those are interesting, but until you build up a big sample of this, so you can, from our point of view, studying the coevolution of human and pathogens to see how these diseases mutate over time in response to environmental changes, that's more interesting to us, and that's a ways down the road, partly because the ancient DNA is so expensive. It's really pricey, and you may not get it. You drill a lot of dry wells. And so I don't think that's our comparative advantage. And the big picture, they're going to need our big picture anyway, the ancient DNA people. They're going to want to know how the DNA they find fits into the larger change of the human condition over the last 10,000 years. I think they're putting the cart ahead of the horse. It's just technologically fascinating, that's all. We can do this, It's a result of Jurassic Park. All this stuff, that you can recreate dinosaurs.
Well, I think if we have no more questions, I think we can safely say that big history is fully back on the agenda. It was an absolutely fascinating talk and really great question and answer session. So I'd like you to join me.